Hi, everybody. It's Patricia Coughlin here. So this is sort of a follow-up to the last video when we were talking about understanding why you're not getting links between feelings toward a current figure, including possibly you in the transference, and people and memories from the past. And one of the major reasons I talked about was that it's really the therapist who's dragging the patient through the portrait. It's not actually being driven by the experience of genuine feeling in the patient. So someone wrote to ask, well, how do I know if I'm dragging somebody through a portrait? My first response is you're going to know because you're going to feel like you're dragging them through, right? That you're the one who's in the driver's seat. You're having to prompt, and then what, and then what, and what else, and then what happens. So if you start to feel like you're the one driving the process and the patient isn't really engaged and there's not a sense of spontaneity in the portrayal, then I would stop and backtrack and ask, I'm wondering if you're really feeling this anger or grief or whatever it is that you're actually focusing on. So that really takes us back again to the basics. Are you going for the portrait at the right time? You have to make sure, again, Dav and Lou articulated 3 elements of feeling that you want to make sure are in evidence before you proceed to the portrait. So one is a very clear articulation of the feeling in question and the person the feeling is toward in a very specific situation. So I'm feeling really angry with my neighbor because last week, they did X, Y, and Z. Okay, so it's a particular feeling toward a specific person, and then you make sure that you're in a very specific, recent example, right? So once you've got that online, then you're going to ask, so how do you experience this anger inside? How do you feel it in your body? You want to make sure that the patient is actually experiencing the physiological concomitants of the feeling that is being expressed. So whether that's love and sexual desire or grief or anger, right? There's a signature to those feelings, and that's quite universal. So, with anger, it's going to be a feeling of heat and energy rising from the center. It tends to get, you're going to see then activation. So once you've got the label, the physiological activation, you'll often start to spontaneously see activation of the impulse, right, that accompanies that feeling. So with anger, it might be tension in the jaw, in the shoulders, activation of the hands and fists, or feet going like in a kicking motion. And that is your signal. Once the impulse is actually mobilized and you can see it in evidence, that is the best time for you to say, and if that anger came out, what does your fist want to do? Often people are going for the impulse and for the portrait much too early. The patient is not actually activated physiologically, and there's no signaling of the impulse actually being registered in the body. So make sure that you have all 3 in evidence. The only caveat here is that if you're working with a patient who's quite fragile and has low capacity, you might use just an awareness of anger to build capacity. And you might even say, like if you just lost control, what would that anger want to do? You're very consciously and intentionally doing that at a very low level of activation, because being activated stimulates so much anxiety that they go over threshold. Right, but in 80% of the cases, right, when you're going for a breakthrough of feeling with people who have more capacity, you want to make sure that your timing is right and that the patient is actually physiologically activated and that you have real evidence in front of you that the impulses are mobilized. And when that's the case, it really should be quite a spontaneous outpouring. So even though initially they might say, "Oh, no, I'm not a violent person. I would never do anything." Again, I'll say, "Well, I'm very glad to hear that." And you're telling us that you have great control. So it's not about you actually doing this, right? But facing the impulses that are getting mobilized to do it, because we know you end up turning this back on yourself. You get depressed, you have headaches, you have fatigue, right? But let's see how you feel this anger toward the other person, okay? So you might still run into some obstacles along the way, again, especially once the anger has been released. Often, not always, sometimes it will flow right into guilt and grief and then love. But other times people resist those mixed feelings. They kind of like the experience of being angry and strong and getting back at this person, because the rage is almost always retaliatory. But then they don't want to feel, right, the guilt or the grief or the love, right? And in that case, again, you're going to have to do some work to say, well, is that really I can remember this, it's just triggering a memory of someone who had the most vicious, sadistic rage toward her father. I mean, it was one of the most brutal portraits I've ever encountered. And yet, spontaneously, there was no guilt or grief. And so I just said to her, well, is anger the only feeling you have towards your father? And that's when she said, well, no, I love my father. And then she started to talk about her positive memories. And then, right, the guilt came up. So, of course, you've got to be flexible, and it's going to be different in every case. But in most cases, you're dragging somebody through when you have gone to the portrait much too early, when the person is not activated, or they're just going along with you and they're being compliant and they're wanting to please you, but they're not really authentically involved in the experience. So you have to be aware of that also. And again, if you have that sense that it's a bit of a drag, then I would just ask, are you really in touch with this? Is this something that you feel is genuine inside of you and it's important for you to look at? Or are you just going along with me? And again, you're keeping your whole case formulation in mind. And is this somebody who has a characteristic tendency to comply with authority and just go along? If so, you're going to really be working on that throughout, right? So is that so, or you're just saying what you think I want to hear? Okay, so I hope this is helpful to you. And again, really welcome questions, comments, and your feedback. Bye-bye.